We like to think we're in control of our own story, but what if we've been reading the narrative backwards all along? What if the real authors of life have been hidden in plain sight, writing themselves into existence, generation after generation, since the very beginning? There is something profoundly counterintuitive about the way life works. We look at the natural world and we see cooperation, beauty, elaborate structures built with what appears to be purpose and foresight. A bird building a nest seems to know what it's doing. A parent sacrificing for its young appears noble, even selfless. When you watch a mother stay awake all night with a sick child, or see a father work 2 jobs to provide for his family, it feels like love in its purest form. And it is. But when we examine the underlying machinery of life with the tools of modern biology, we discover something quite different from what our intuitions suggest. We find that the story of life is not primarily about organisms at all, but about something much smaller, much simpler, and in a very specific sense, much more selfish. Let us begin with a simple observation, one that might seem obvious, but contains within it a revolution in understanding. All living things on Earth share a common feature: they contain information. This information is encoded in molecules called DNA, and it's this information that gets passed from generation to generation. When a bacterium divides, it copies its DNA. When humans reproduce, they pass on their DNA to their children. The DNA molecule is, in essence, a recipe, a set of instructions for building and maintaining a living body. But here's the crucial insight that changes everything. The body is temporary, but the information can be immortal. Think about it this way, and think about your own life as you do. You and I are temporary assemblies of molecules. We were born, we will die, and our bodies will return to the elements from which they were constructed. That's a sobering thought, but there's wonder in it too. The information that built us, the genetic code that specified our general form, has been flowing through time for billions of years. The genes you carry today are direct descendants of genes that existed in your ancestors thousands, millions, even billions of years ago. They have survived by making copies of themselves, generation after generation, body after body. When you look at your hands, you're looking at structures built by instructions that have been refined over hundreds of millions of years. In this light, we can see that genes are the fundamental units of life, and our bodies are the vehicles they build to ensure their own replication. Now, when we say a gene is selfish, we must be very careful about what we mean. This is where many people understandably feel uncomfortable, and it's worth taking the time to be clear. We are not suggesting that genes have conscious desires or malicious intentions. A gene is simply a stretch of DNA, a molecule, nothing more. It has no mind, no feelings, no awareness. It doesn't plot or scheme. It doesn't want anything, but genes do have effects. The information encoded in a gene influences the development and behavior of the body that carries it. And some genes, by pure chance, happen to have effects that result in their own increased replication. These are the genes that survive. The others, the ones whose effects do not promote their own copying, gradually disappear from the population. It's not personal. It's not cruel. It's simply what happens. This is natural selection, but viewed from an unfamiliar angle. We often think of natural selection as a process that favors organisms that are good at surviving and reproducing. And that's true as far as it goes. But why are organisms good at surviving and reproducing? Because they are built by genes whose previous effects led to successful survival and reproduction. The organism is not the fundamental unit being selected. The gene is. The organism is the gene's way of making more genes. This might sound cold when you first hear it, but stay with me, because understanding this opens up a new way of seeing the world, one that actually makes the beauty and complexity of life even more remarkable. Consider a simple example from everyday life. Imagine a gene that causes an animal to care for its offspring. This might seem like a straightforward case of parental love, and in our human experience it is. The exhausted mother who wakes at 3 a.m. to feed her crying baby isn't thinking about genes or evolution. She's responding to a deep, powerful emotion. That emotion is real. The love is real. But from the gene's perspective, the situation looks different. And offspring shares half of its genes with each parent. Therefore, a gene that causes a parent to invest resources in keeping its offspring alive is indirectly helping copies of itself to survive. The gene that promotes parental care is being selfish in the most literal sense. It is promoting its own replication. It just happens to do so by creating what we experience as love, devotion, and self-sacrifice. Does understanding this make a mother's love less beautiful? I would argue it makes it more so. We're not just seeing the emotion at the surface. We're seeing the deep evolutionary history that shaped that emotion, the millions of years of ancestors whose love for their children allowed those genes to survive into the present. Your capacity to love your children exists because your ancestors loved theirs. It's a chain of care stretching back through time. Stretching back through time. This framework explains a great deal about the natural world. It explains why parents care for their children, why siblings sometimes cooperate and sometimes compete, why animals form social groups with their relatives. The mathematics of genetic relatedness predicts with remarkable accuracy just how much cooperation we should expect to see between organisms of varying degrees of kinship. A gene in you is 50% likely to be present in your sibling, 25% likely to be in your cousin, and so on. Therefore, genes that cause you to help your relatives in proportion to how closely related they are will tend to propagate. This is not conscious calculation on anyone's part. You don't love your sister more than your cousin because you've done the math. You feel what you feel. But the reason those feelings exist, the reason they have the rough proportions they do, is because genes creating those feelings survived better than genes that didn't. But the implications go further still if genes are fundamentally selfish. If their only purpose, in a purely descriptive sense, is to replicate themselves, then we must reconsider many of the things we observe in nature. Take altruism, for instance. We see animals behaving in ways that appear genuinely selfless. A bird gives an alarm call when it spots a predator, even though this draws attention to itself and increases its own risk. A prairie dog stands up on its hind legs and barks a warning, making itself conspicuous. How? Cow. Can this be explained if genes are selfish, Diver? The answer lies in understanding what benefits the gene, not necessarily what benefits the individual organism. If that alarm calling bird lives in a group with its relatives, then by warning the group, it is helping to preserve copies of its own genes in the bodies of its kin. The gene for alarm calling spreads, not because it helps the caller, but because it helps the gene. The individual may pay a price, may even die as a result of calling attention to itself, but the gene benefits on average across many such situations. This is what we call kin selection, and it's a powerful force in evolution. There's another mechanism that produces cooperation, even between unrelated individuals, and it's equally fascinating because it shows up in human society all the time. Imagine two animals that repeatedly encounter each other. One has a gene that causes it to groom parasites off its partner. This costs time and energy. But if the partner reciprocates, both benefit. A gene for reciprocal cooperation can spread through a population because individuals carrying it do better than pure cheats. This is the evolutionary basis for friendship, for trade, for much of human social life. But notice, the gene is still being selfish. It's not cooperating out of abstract kindness. It's cooperating because cooperation, under the right circumstances, is a strategy that promotes the gene's own replication. This framework, viewing life through the lens of gene-centered selection, illuminates patterns that would otherwise seem mysterious or even contradictory. It explains why organisms age and die. Our bodies are built to last long enough to reproduce and perhaps to care for offspring until they're independent. After that, from the gene's perspective, we're expendable. Resources invested in maintaining an aging body could be better spent building new bodies. It's a cold calculation when stated that way, but it's the calculation that genes, through the blind process of natural selection, have effectively made over millions of generations. This doesn't mean aging is good or that we shouldn't try to extend healthy human lifespan. Understanding a process doesn't mean we have to accept its outcomes as desirable. It explains conflicts within families, the kind of tensions that almost everyone has experienced. Parent and offspring don't have identical genetic interests. An offspring is completely related to itself, but only 50% related to its siblings. A parent is equally related to all its offspring. This creates a tension. An offspring may demand more resources than the parent is evolutionarily inclined to give, because investing too much in one offspring comes at the expense of future offspring. This is why weaning is often a conflict-ridden process, why toddlers throw tantrums, why teenagers push boundaries. The interests of the genes in the parent and the genes in the offspring are not perfectly aligned. Understanding this doesn't solve family conflicts, but it might help us be a bit more patient with the difficulties, knowing they arise from something deeper than mere stubbornness. It even explains some puzzling features of sex itself. Why do sexual organisms exist at all? Think about it. Asexual reproduction is more efficient. And a sexual organism passes on all its genes to its offspring. not just half. It doesn't need to waste time and energy finding a mate. And yet, sexual reproduction is incredibly common. The reason appears to be that sexual reproduction has advantages when it comes to generating genetic diversity, which helps populations adapt to changing environments and resist parasites. The genes that promote sexual reproduction spread because they create bodies that are better at surviving the challenges posed by a changing world, particularly the evolutionary arms race with parasites and pathogens that are constantly evolving to exploit their hosts. Now, it's worth pausing here to address a common and important misunderstanding. None of this means that organisms are conscious strategists calculating genetic payoffs before every action. When you help a friend, you're not thinking about reciprocal altruism. When you love your child, you're not thinking about genetic fitness. These are genuine emotions, genuine motivations. Nor does it mean that humans are slaves to our genes, unable to act against our evolutionary programming. This is crucial to understand. What it means is that the behavioral tendencies and emotional inclinations we possess exist because they tended in our evolutionary past to promote the replication of the genes that built brains with those tendencies and inclinations. Humans are different from other animals in a crucial way. We have culture, we have language, we have the ability to transmit information not just through genes, but through learning, teaching, and imitation. We can choose to act against our genetic inclinations. A person can decide not to have children, or to adopt unrelated children, or to donate resources to strangers on the other side of the world. These behaviors might not maximize genetic fitness in the traditional sense, but they're entirely consistent with human nature, because human nature includes the capacity for reason, empathy, and moral choice. We are the only species, as far as we know, that can understand its evolutionary origins and then choose to act in ways that transcend those origins. Understanding the selfish gene doesn't tell us how we ought to behave. This is absolutely vital to grasp. It tells us why we have the instincts and emotions we have. It's a description of the process that built us, not a prescription for how we should live. The naturalistic fallacy, the mistake of thinking that what is natural is therefore good, is exactly that, a fallacy. Evolution by natural selection has created our capacities for both cooperation and violence, for both love and hatred. We get to choose which of these capacities to cultivate and which to restrain. In fact, understanding our evolutionary origins can help us make better choices. If we know that we have inherited tendencies toward tribalism, toward favoring our own group over others, we can consciously work to overcome these tendencies. We can build societies based on principles of fairness and compassion that extend beyond the narrow circle of genetic relatives. We can recognize that our instinctive suspicion of people who look different from us is a relic of our evolutionary past, not a reliable guide to who deserves our respect and consideration. Understanding doesn't determine behavior, but it can inform better decisions. There's another dimension to this story that deserves attention, one that's particularly relevant to human life. Genes don't just build bodies. Genes don't just build bodies. They build brains. And brains generate culture. Culture evolves, in some ways like genes do. Ideas spread from mind to mind. Some ideas, by virtue of their content or their emotional appeal, spread more successfully than others. We might call these successful ideas memes, to draw an analogy with genes. A catchy tune, a useful technology, a compelling story, a religious doctrine, all of these are memes, units of cultural information that replicate themselves by influencing human behavior. Memes and genes interact in complex ways. Our genetic evolution gave us brains capable of culture. Our culture now shapes the environment in which our genes evolve. We've created medicine which allows people with genetic conditions to survive and reproduce who would not have in the ancestral environment. We've created agriculture, cities, moral systems, all of which change the selection pressures acting on our genes. In the modern world, natural selection on human genes has not stopped, but it operates in an environment utterly transformed by culture. The genes that do well in modern New York or Tokyo are not necessarily the same genes that would have done well on the African savanna 100,000 years ago. This raises profound questions about the future. We now have technologies that allow us to directly manipulate genes, to read and edit the code of life itself. We are beginning to understand the genetic basis of diseases, of behaviors, of the traits that make us who we are. A couple can now screen embryos for genetic disorders. Scientists can edit genes to cure diseases. These capabilities will only grow more powerful. How we use this knowledge will depend not on our genes, but on our choices, our values, our collective wisdom. These are not decisions that science alone can make. They require ethical reflection, democratic deliberation, and a deep sense of responsibility for the world we're creating. It's important to recognize what the gene-centered view does and does not imply. It does not say that everything about us is genetically determined. We are products of both genes and environment, of nature and nurture interacting. In ways so complex that we're only beginning to understand them. Your genes might influence your height, but so does your nutrition as a child. Your genes might influence your temperament, but so do your experiences, your relationships, the culture you grow up in. It does not say that genetic explanations are the only kind of explanation worth having. Psychology, sociology, economics, history, these disciplines offer their own valid perspectives, their own levels of analysis. Understanding the genetic level doesn't make the others irrelevant. A complete understanding of human behavior requires insights from all these fields and more. What the gene-centered view does offer is a fundamental explanation for why life exists, why it has the characteristics it has, why it has the characteristics it has, why organisms behave as they do. It provides a unifying framework that makes sense of the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth, from bacteria to blue whales, from viruses to humans. All living things are ultimately expressions of information encoded in genes, information that has survived over billions of years, information that has survived by building bodies that successfully replicate those genes. This is not a reductionist claim that nothing matters except genes. It's a recognition that genes are the fundamental units of heredity and evolution, the things that get passed on and modified over generations. There's something humbling and awe-inspiring about this realization. We are not the pinnacle of creation, designed with some ultimate purpose in mind. We are the temporary custodians of genes that have been on a journey through time since the origin of life itself. We carry within us a history written in DNA, a record of every ancestor that successfully reproduced, stretching back through millions of generations to the first self-bear, replicating molecules in the ancient seas of Earth. Every human being alive today is the product of an unbroken chain of successful reproduction going back billions of years. Not one of your ancestors died before reproducing. That's an extraordinary thing when you think about it. And yet, despite our humble origins, or perhaps because of them, we have achieved something extraordinary. We are the first species, as far as we know, that can understand its own origins. We can read the code of life. We can trace our lineage back through time. We can understand the process that created us. This understanding doesn't diminish us. It elevates us. It elevates us. It gives us the power to reflect on our nature, to make conscious choices about our future, to transcend, in some measure, the blind forces that built us. A bird cannot understand why it builds its nest the way it does. We can understand why we do what we do, and that understanding gives us a degree of freedom that no other species possesses. The study of genes and evolution reveals a universe that operates according to principles we can understand. Principles of chemistry and physics and mathematics. There is no magic required, no supernatural intervention needed to explain the origin and diversity of life. The process is natural, observable, testable, and that is etc. And that is wonderful, not disappointing. It means that we can learn, we can discover, we can improve our understanding over time. Science is not a collection of unchanging dogmas, but a method for finding out what's true. A method that embraces uncertainty and values evidence over authority. When the evidence changes, our understanding changes. That's not a weakness. That's a strength. As we reflect on the selfish gene, we might feel a range of emotions. Some find the idea disturbing, as if it diminishes the beauty of life or the authenticity of human love and altruism. But this is a misreading, and it's worth being very clear about why. Understanding the evolutionary origins of our emotions doesn't make them less real or less valuable. Love is no less profound because it has an evolutionary explanation. The love you feel for your child is not an illusion. It's a real neurological state, a real motivation, a real force in your life. Beauty is no less beautiful because we understand the selection pressures that shaped our aesthetic sense. A sunset doesn't become less moving because we understand the physics of light scattering. If anything, understanding deepens our appreciation. We see not just the surface phenomenon, but the deep history, the long journey that produced it. Others might worry about the implications for morality. If we're just vehicles for selfish genes, does that mean we have no free will, no moral responsibility? But this doesn't follow at all. Yes, we are products of evolution. Yes, our brains, which make our choices, are organs shaped by natural selection. But we are still the ones making choices. Our capacity for reason, for empathy, for moral deliberation, these two are products of evolution, but they're real capacities that genuinely shape what we do. Understanding where they came from doesn't eliminate them, or render them illusory. You are not less responsible for your actions, because those actions emerge from a brain built by evolution. You are your brain in a meaningful sense, and your brain makes real choices with real consequences. Perhaps the most important lesson from thinking about selfish genes is intellectual humility. The natural world is far stranger than our intuitions suggest. Things are rarely as they first appear. What looks like pure altruism may have a genetic logic underlying it. What seems purposeful and designed is actually the product of blind variation and selection operating over unimaginable stretches of time. The truth about nature requires patient investigation, careful reasoning, and a willingness to revise our preconceptions when the evidence demands it. This is hard. Our brains evolved to make quick judgments based on limited information. We're pattern-seeking animals. We see purpose and intention everywhere. Overcoming these biases requires discipline and humility. We live in an age of extraordinary scientific discovery. Every year we learn more about genes, about evolution, about the history of life on Earth. Every year the picture becomes clearer, more detailed, more complete. We can now sequence genomes quickly and cheaply. We can watch evolution happening in real time in laboratory populations. We can trace the evolutionary relationships between all living things with unprecedented precision. And yet, every answer raises new questions. We still don't fully understand how the first replicating molecules arose from non-living chemistry. We're only beginning to map the complex interactions between genes and environment that produce a living organism. We have much to learn about consciousness, about intelligence, about the nature of life itself. This is as it should be. Science is not a finished edifice, but an ongoing project, a collective human endeavor to understand the world as it actually is. The gene-centered view of evolution is one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, but it's not the end of the story. It's a chapter, a framework, a tool for understanding. As we learn more, the framework will be refined, extended, perhaps in some ways revised. That's the nature of scientific knowledge. It's provisional. It's subject to correction. It grows. It improves. It gets closer to truth asymptotically through the work of generations of scientists building on what came before. No single person has all the answers. No theory is beyond questioning. And so we return to where we began, but with new eyes. When we look at the living world now, we see not just organisms going about their business, but lineages of genes stretching back through time, constantly being tested by the environment, constantly being shaped by selection. We see cooperation emerging from selfishness, complexity arising from simplicity, and order generated by the interplay of random mutation and non-random survival. We see ourselves as part of this process, connected to all other life through common ancestry, built by the same mechanisms that built every other living thing. The bacteria in your gut, the trees in your garden, the dogs sleeping at your feet, all of these are your relatives, connected to you through the great tree of life. This understanding is liberating in ways that might not be immediately obvious. It frees us from false certainties and allows us to see the world as it actually is, not as we might wish it to be or as tradition tells us it should be. It reminds us that we are part of nature, not separate. E from it, not above it, and that our fate is intertwined with the fate of the biosphere that produced us. We depend on other species for our survival, for the air we breathe, the food we eat, the climate we live in. Understanding our evolutionary connection to other life might help us recognize our responsibility to preserve it. It suggests that wisdom lies not in denying our evolutionary origins, but in understanding them so that we can make better choices about how to live, how to organize our societies, how to care for the planet and each other. The genes that built us are selfish. Yes, in the technical sense, that they promote their own replication, but we need not be. We have inherited capacities for cooperation, for compassion, for justice. We can use our reason to extend these capacities beyond the boundaries that evolution set. We can care about people we've never met, about future generations, about other species. We can choose to create meaning and purpose in a universe that did not hand these things to us ready-made. We have the power to choose, and that makes all the difference. It's a power that comes with immense responsibility, but also with immense possibility. We are the universe become conscious of itself, in a very literal sense. We are arrangements of atoms that can reflect on their own existence, that can ask where they came from and where they're going. That's a remarkable thing, perhaps the most remarkable thing in the known universe. And it all started with molecules that could make copies of themselves, molecules that were, in the most fundamental sense, selfish. From such simple beginnings, endless forms, most beautiful, have been and are being evolved.